All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at the Indian independence movement from 1915 right through to the 1930s. And honestly, it is a truly fascinating story. We're talking about how an incredibly vast and deeply divided subcontinent actually managed to forge a single, unified national identity to take on the most powerful empire in the world. 13 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. To truly grasp the magnitude of what this movement accomplished, we have to start by understanding the sheer, crushing desperation of the era. By the 1921 census, 13 million Indians had died from famine and disease. See, during World War I, even though India wasn't directly fighting the European conflict, as a British colony, they were bearing the absolute brunt of the cost. The British drastically jacked up taxes, they essentially forced Indians into military recruitment, and they heavily exported the country's resources. On top of all that, crops were failing, and a brutal influenza epidemic was sweeping the nation. The entire country was just in a state of absolute distress.
Fast forward to 1928, and all that desperation had boiled over into a roaring, unified chant, "Go back, Simon." The British had sent an all-British commission to decide India's constitutional future, literally without including a single Indian member. But you have to ask yourself, how did millions of vastly diverse people reach this specific point of unified defiance?
Well, here is our roadmap for this explainer to figure that out. We're going to cover the rise of Satyagraha, the non-cooperation movement, differing visions of freedom, the shift to civil disobedience, the limits of the movement, and finally, how a shared national identity was forged.
Okay, kicking things off with Section 1, the rise of Satyagraha.
So the year is 1915, and Mahatma Gandhi returns to India from South Africa, and he brings with him this revolutionary new concept, Satyagraha. Now, it's crucial to understand this wasn't just some clever political tactic. It was a fundamental philosophy. Gandhi firmly believed that if your cause was true, and if you were fighting against injustice, then physical force literally wasn't necessary. He believed that truth and strict nonviolence alone could defeat British oppression without ever picking up a single weapon.
But you don't just roll a massive philosophy like that out nationwide on day one. Gandhi actually stress-tested this nonviolent resistance in 3 distinct, local, micro-level struggles. Down in Champaran, he stood with peasants who were being forced to grow indigo. Over in Kedah, he supported farmers who were just crippled by crop failure and insane taxes. And in Ahmedabad, he backed cotton mill workers who were demanding fair wages. And here's the thing. All 3 of these localized, nonviolent protests were highly successful.
But, as you might expect, that success drew a really harsh reaction. In 1919, the British slammed down the Rowlatt Act. People called it the Black Law, which basically allowed them to throw political prisoners in jail without a trial. No way were people going to accept that, so Gandhi called for a peaceful nationwide strike. Well, the British escalated things rapidly. Police started firing on peaceful processions, and then came April 13th, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. It's truly horrific. General Dyer trapped innocent, unarmed festival-goers inside an enclosed ground and just ordered his troops to open fire, killing hundreds. The sheer brutality of this sparked widespread clashes and violence all across North India. And because Gandhi was so strictly opposed to violence, he felt he had no choice but to call off this entire initial wave of satyagraha.
Which brings us to Section 2, the non-cooperation movement.
So Gandhi realizes that minor, isolated movements just aren't going to cut it anymore. He needed a massive, macro-level strategy. And to do that, he absolutely needed Hindu-Muslim unity. So he pulls off this brilliant political alignment. He takes the push for Swaraj, which is self-rule, and he merges it with the Caliphate issue. This was a major concern for Indian Muslims regarding how the spiritual head of the Islamic world was being treated after World War I. By partnering with Muslim leaders like the Ali brothers, he essentially forged one massive, unified front.
And the logic driving this entire new movement? It was actually incredibly simple, and Gandhi laid it out years earlier in his 1909 book, Hind Swaraj. He said British rule only survives in India because Indians cooperate with it. Withdraw that cooperation, and the whole system completely collapses. So starting in 1921, they unleashed the plan. Just picture the streets back then. You've got thousands of people surrendering their government titles, lawyers flat out boycotting the courts, students walking out of their government schools. The masses even built these massive bonfires, throwing in imported foreign clothes and choosing instead to proudly wear hand-spun Indian khadi.
Moving right along to Section 3, differing visions of freedom.
Now, this is where things get really fascinating. When that national call for Swaraj went out, it was basically like a giant game of telephone. The message changed dramatically depending on who was hearing it. In Awadh, the peasants weren't really focused on the British. They were fighting their own oppressive local landlords. Over in the Gudam Hills, tribal populations who were furious over strict forest laws interpreted Swaraj as armed guerrilla warfare led by Aludi Sitaram Raju. And in Assam, plantation workers thought Swaraj meant defying emigration laws, walking off the plantations and just going home. Literally everyone mapped this broad national call directly onto their own intense local day-to-day grievances.
And that major disconnect eventually hit a tragic breaking point. In 1922, in a town called Chowri Chowra, a clash with local police escalated completely out of control. An angry crowd set a police station on fire and several policemen were killed. For Gandhi, this was the ultimate red line. The violence proved to him that the masses simply weren't properly trained for true nonviolent resistance yet, and he abruptly halted the entire non-cooperation movement.
All right, Section 4, Salt and Civil Disobedience. So after a bit of a political lull and smack in the middle of the Great Economic Depression of 1929, the Lahore Congress makes this incredibly bold new demand. Purna Swaraj, meaning complete independence. And with that, the strategy shifted dramatically. The goal wasn't just refusing to cooperate anymore. They were going to actively, deliberately break colonial laws. It was a massive, massive step up in defiance. 240 miles. To launch this aggressive, law-breaking phase, Gandhi needed a symbol that was universally understood, and he chose salt. Something so basic, literally provided for free by the ocean, yet heavily taxed and monopolized by the British Empire. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi and his followers started a 240-mile march to the coastal town of Dandi. They walked for 24 days, and when they finally arrived, Gandhi simply boiled some seawater to illegally manufacture salt. That one brilliantly simple act of defiance officially sparked the civil disobedience movement, and it prompted millions to start breaking colonial laws all across the country.
That takes us to Section 5, Limits of the Movement.
Now, as massive as the civil disobedience movement was, and we're talking unprecedented participation from business classes and thousands of women stepping out of their homes to protest, we have to look at its limits. Total national unity was still deeply elusive because of these long-standing social divides. Take the Dalit community. Historically ignored by the Congress Party, they understandably sought their own political empowerment. Their leader, B.R. Ambedkar, clashed with Gandhi over demanding separate electorates, which eventually led to a compromise with the Pune Pact of 1932 for reserved seats. Similarly, large sections of the Muslim community felt really alienated after the Caliphate movement ended. Tensions were rising with Hindu nationalist groups, and despite efforts by leaders like Muhammad Ali Jinnah to bridge the gap, negotiations just fell apart. So this deep-seated mistrust meant that millions of people ultimately held back from participating.
And finally, Section 6, Forging a National Identity.
So we've seen that the political movements had some serious fractures and limits. How then did a shared sense of belonging actually take root across such a vast divided subcontinent? Well, the answer lies mostly outside of traditional politics. It was a massive cultural awakening. Think of it kind of like the viral media of their day. Leaders like Rabindranath Tagore traveled from village to village, reviving cultural folklore and traditional songs. Artists created a visual personification of the nation as Bharat Mata, or Mother India, giving people a highly emotional, tangible image to revere, especially when paired with the powerful hymn Vande Mataram. They designed unifying symbols, like that iconic tricolor flag with the spinning wheel in the center. And crucially, they completely reinterpreted ancient history. They pushed right back against the British narrative that Indians were somehow primitive, and instead they highlighted a glorious past filled with incredible art, agriculture, and culture.
Which really brings us to the core takeaway of this whole explainer. The Indian independence struggle wasn't just one out in the streets with boycotts and marches. It was one in the hearts and minds of the people, through folklore, art, and deeply shared symbols. And that leaves us with a profound reminder. As you look at modern movements today, ask yourself, do they rely entirely on political mobilization, or do they truly harness the unifying emotional power of a shared cultural identity? Think about that for a bit. I really hope this deep dive gave you a much clearer picture of this incredible period in history.